Hello and welcome to yet another episode of the new series. My name is Pooja Dwivedi. Today we are going to discuss the status of domestic workers in India. Are they protected or not? What are the sanctions with respect to protection of domestic workers around the world? And what is the trend, the issues and the way forward? So without any further delay, these are the many topics that we ought to discuss from the perspective of GS Mains paper 2nd as well as 3rd. So first of all, let us look at the news. Earlier this month, social workers have rescued a 14-year-old girl from Gurugram home where she was tortured by her employers. Originally, she hails from Jharkhand and she was employed for the past 5 months. She has sustained several injuries, including cut and burn injuries reportedly inflicted with a blade or hot tongs. An FIR has been already registered under the Indian Penal Code, the Juvenile Justice Act and the Protection of Children from the Sexual Offences Act, of course, because she is below the age of 18 years. And an anti-trafficking unit has been formulated by the Jharkhand police to probe the incident, and she has also been promised rehabilitation through education and welfare measures. So this shows the general outlook that the middle class and the high class employers have in their mind towards the lesser people belonging from the lesser privileged regions. Now, of course, most of the victims belong to the castes which are not very held up high in our society. Other than that, they belong to the weaker states. And of course, they are either women or children, or sometimes both. Moving ahead, since 2012, it has been reported, as in a 2012 study, it was reported that 39 lakh people have been employed as domestic workers and at least 26 lakh were women amongst them. There was a lack of centralized data with respect to the domestic workers. That is why we cannot be sure because the official figures could be much higher. International Labour Organization places the count anywhere between 20 million and 90 million. And these generally belong to the marginalized caste and underprivileged locations. 75% of domestic workers were from scheduled castes, 15 were from OBC and 8 were from scheduled tribes. Moving ahead, a large number of girls and women in India originate from states like Jharkhand, Bihar, Bengal and Orissa who work into this industry. Regions with a sizable population which have a population living under the poverty line, they are much more prevalent to be found in employed in this domestic workers industry. Jharkhand has the highest school dropout rate in India, and that is why girls and children who have dropped out of school because of their conditions, economic conditions, they are compelled to work as domestic help. Also, the non-availability of jobs and low literacy rates among the rural and tribal population is the most chronic reason why we find such underprivileged population as domestic workers. More than 12.6 million domestic workers in the country are minors, with 86% of them being girls. Moving ahead, now if we talk about another important point, 25% of the underage domestic workers, they were below 14 years of age, and of the total increase in the number of female workers in the labor force, 14.4% contributed to the domestic workforce. Now, because of the lack of any sort of policy, a dedicated policy for domestic workers, they are highly underpaid and even unpaid. Rough monthly income reported by domestic workers in New Delhi was chalked up to be rupees 1875. This is according to a 2009 study, which is much below the minimum wage. There is no legal contract that could be entered between the employer and the employees when it comes to this industry, which translates into ill-defined working hours. Sometimes they can be made to work for 24 hours per day, as in if they are staying at home. There is discrimination and violence as there is no social security scheme. Sexual harassment and exploitation are at the hands of the placement agencies or traffickers as well. Now, between 2010 and 2012, the violence against them has increased from 3422 to 3564. This has been the increase. About 57% of the domestic workers who have been surveyed between Kochi, Delhi and Mumbai in 2020 reported stigma as well as discrimination at workplace, and 40% worked without any social security or safety measures. Moving ahead, Now, ILO has defined domestic work as a modern slavery practice. In domestic workers, including minors, remain vulnerable to abuse, exploitation, forced labor as well as trafficking. And the ILO Forced Labor Convention 1930 has defined forced labor as work which is exacted from any person under the menace of any penalty and which is not offered voluntarily, because sometimes they are not at all paid for it. Women are more likely to engage in in forced labor than others in the form of domestic workers. Okay, moving ahead, if we talk about the Palermo Protocol, which is a UN protocol, it has defined trafficking as well as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of threat or use of force or other forms of coercion or abduction, or fraud or deception. It also envisages payment to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of re-exploitation and exploitation. Now, Section 370 of the Indian Penal Code has criminalized trafficking offences, which includes physical and sexual exploitation, slavery or similar practices, and servitude, and although there is no express mention of trafficking for labor. Now, minors and mostly young women are offered work by placement agencies, promising them a high standard of living and lifestyle, which is generally not correct. And rough estimates have shown that Delhi has about 800 to 1,000 placement agencies itself. This is a placement agency. They will recruit people belonging to the underprivileged area and caste, and then traffic them at a higher price to the middle class and the high income class households, and then they are made to work in a forced manner. So this is what happens. But there is little transparency in the way they operate. Workers are not told about the employment contract, working hours, what will they get. Agents often disappear after placing them in middle or high income households. Now, internal migration from poorer to wealthier states in India is very common. The ILO has further examined two most witness type of pattern, that is Jharkhand to New Delhi and Kerala to Arab states. Then the report also found that inadequate regulations have allowed unregistered agents, which are beyond the scope of any sort of government action, to work in this industry. So these are the issues. But no dedicated law or policy to regulate people who are working in the domestic work industry is there. Indian labor laws also do not adequately include such workers. There is limited interpretation of the definition of workman, employer, or establishment, because if the home as a private space can constitute a place of work, how will we define it? People reside in the same quarters as the family they are working for, and moreover, the gendered nature of work, which involves cooking, cleaning, these all are unpaid in nature generally for the workers. Now, the first legal recognition for it came in the year 2008 by the help of Unorganized Social Security Act of 2008, which was meant to provide social welfare to workers, including the domestic workers. And the Code on Social Security 2020 is yet to come in force. The National Commission of Women proposed a draft domestic workers bill in 2008 after the exploitation of live-in workers from tribal societies was reported. It was subsequently put on hold by the government. The Indian government prohibited minors from entering into domestic household in 2006 because they defined this work as hazardous child labor. The Juvenile Justice Act of 2000 further protects minors, and the complications arise when the Child Labor Act 1986 comes into picture. It states domestic work is prohibited for employment for children only up to the age of 14 years, which is this is not completely what we are envisioning for India. It means that children above 14 can legally work under specified condition without falling under the scrutiny of the Juvenile Justice Act. Okay. And in 2011, India voted in favor of the landmark ILO Convention 189 aimed at ensuring the legal protection of domestic workers, but it has not been ratified as of yet. That means there has not been any sort of domestic legislation to support this signing. India is also not a signatory to conventions number 182 on the worst forms of child labor and number 189 on decent work for domestic workers. These have been deemed critical, very crucial of lately. In June 2019, the Labour Ministry drafted a national domestic workers policy. This was to regulate placement agencies which are not working correctly, and include domestic workers under existing laws. They would have right to minimum wage, access to social security, protection from abuse and exploitation, also pension schemes, health and insurance benefits. But the policy has not been implemented as of yet 2023, so we need to implement it as soon as possible. I hope you understood this segment. That's it. Thank you so much for watching.